proud to help bring the Iowa broadcast of Washington Week in Review to you. ANR Pipeline Company urges you to support public television.
Clarence Thomas rides out the storm. Tonight's top story on Washington Week in Review.
Ford Motor Company, worldwide manufacturer of automotive products, has provided funding for this program. At Ford, quality is job one. Funding for this program was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.
Now, here's moderator Paul Duke.
Good evening. The dramatic and bruising battle over Judge Thomas is over, but the repercussions may be just beginning. As the newest justice, Thomas will take his place on the Supreme Court, having been confirmed by the closest vote of any nominee this century. He's expected to push the court further to the right, a prospect that may spur women's groups to be more politically active. The bloody fight was one of a series of defeats this week for Democrats who seem unable to stop George Bush's White House steamroller. Stopping by for us tonight, Haynes Johnson of the Washington Post, Julie Johnson of Time, Jack Nelson of the Los Angeles Times, and Gloria Borger of U.S. News and World Report. Well, Capitol Hill's great mini-series drama is over, Gloria, and Mr. Justice Thomas will take his place on the Supreme Court.
Yes, Paul, it was like nothing I've ever been through, and I'm sure our viewing audience feels like they were there with us every step of the way. It wasn't that long ago that Anita Hill first charged that Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And then this last weekend, we had those incredible X-rated hearings at the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they were watched by more than 20 million Americans. And then finally this week, in a very dramatic vote on the Senate floor, very close, 52 to 48, Clarence Thomas was confirmed, and it was the closest confirmation vote in the last century. And when all the noise was over, Paul, there had only been 3 Democratic senators who had previously supported Thomas who actually changed their mind. But what happened here for the American public was that they really got a glimpse about how the Senate works, warts and all. They heard a lot about a leak and how terrible that was, and they saw senators arguing publicly, angry at each other, tired, and just exhausted with the whole process. And they saw witnesses testify about the most emotional, private details of their lives. And then behind the scenes, there was another drama. The White House working furiously with the Republicans on the committee to try and get Clarence Thomas confirmed and impeach the integrity of Anita Hill. And in the end, the public seemed to believe their story by a margin of 2 to 1. And now this week, when it was all over, there was plenty of blame to go around. The Republicans were blaming the Democrats. The Democrats were charging the Republicans with hardball politics. The women's group were outraged at the Democrats. And when we look back on this, maybe the only clear winners are going to be the people who were pushing for term limits.
When we were sitting around this table just a week ago, Gloria, there was a sense that Clarence Thomas might be defeated. So what happened during these 8 days of October drama that really changed the tide and enabled him to pull out his nomination battle?
Well, I think what you saw happen was that what had once been an inside game, trying to convince 100 members of the Senate to confirm Clarence Thomas, became an outside game. The White House went into those hearings with a clear strategy. They were going to get Clarence Thomas confirmed. And the Democrats came in, having been under a lot of heavy criticism for trying to cover up this whole story or whitewash it. They came in saying, we're going to be the seekers of the truth. And so Clarence Thomas had lawyers sitting on that committee who were working for him, and Anita Hill didn't have any. And in the end, the strategy worked for the Republicans.
Public opinion also worked in favor of Judge Thomas.
That's right, because what happened was the White House strategy, run by Missouri Senator Jack Danforth and former White House Chief of Staff Ken Duberstein, said, look, we're going to take this to the American people. What we're going to do, two clear things. We have a good witness in Clarence Thomas. We're going to put him on in prime time, make sure everybody sees him, and then we're going to split the Democratic coalition down the women. We're going to try and get the women to believe him, and we're going to try and get black voters to believe him, and that's what they did.
But Gloria, excuse me, well, let me ask you. The strategy that worked, it seems, was when Clarence Thomas himself said it was racism. He was being lynched over and over again, using that metaphor. High-tech lynching, like the past, hanging to a tree, all those things. That seemed to do it. Was that part of the White House strategy?
Well, they say, his handlers, as we call them, say that that was pure Clarence Thomas, that they did not tell him to play the race card. Danforth says that was Thomas's own line. But once he said it, they knew that they had struck a bullseye. And then, after Clarence Thomas said it, it came up again and again at the hearings, and that struck a nerve with the American people.
And it's not the first time the race card has been played in recent years. It's 88, Willie Horton, all this.
And I might tell you that the Democrats on the committee don't believe the White House for a moment. They think that it was calculated, and we may never know the truth.
Well, whether it was or not, we do know the White House orchestrated most of the strategy.
Yeah, you know, they went into high gear here. It wasn't just the handlers. It was lawyers at the Justice Department, lawyers at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, people working their computer banks to try and discredit, pick apart every piece of Anita Hill's testimony. And the Republicans on the committee acted as the front men. They were the guys pushing the news out there, raising the questions, being handed the papers from the back room by people working for Thomas.
But Gloria, isn't this the first time we really saw the real Judge Thomas? I mean, I spoke with friends of his right before his re-emergence before the committee who said he was fed up. He didn't like the way he came off when he was answering a question saying he didn't have even a thought in his mind about Roe v. Wade. And so he told the White House, in his friend's words, to butt out. And so when he came in that morning, I think we all heard him that morning say, no one saw the text of my comments except for my wife and, Jack Danforth, his closest Senate handler. But what does this tell us about Judge Thomas? I mean, the White House in some ways had it both ways. They picked a gentleman for the Supreme Court for a seat being vacated by a black man. And yet at the same time, the White House has always run away from using tokens or race or quotas. Here they got it both ways.
I think the initial White House strategy was really discredited. They were fighting the last war when Justice Souter came as a blank slate, and they thought that they could do that with Clarence Thomas. Forget about the substance, pay attention to the character. Suddenly, character became the big issue. Thomas had no credibility, having said he never discussed Roe v. Wade. And Thomas told them, look, I've got to handle this. This is my life. I don't care about getting this seat on the Supreme Court anymore.
In fact, he said that.
That's right. I have to clear my name. And I think that's exactly what he intended to do. When they saw him, they thought, wow, this guy is good.
Julie's point about that, the character question, and Thomas, there were several people who made the point, Robert Byrd most notably, the senator from West Virginia, that this said something about his judicial temperament, the fact that he wouldn't listen to the testimony about him from Anita Hill, the fact that he got so angry, and that this was seemed to suggest a rigid cast of mind. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's hard to know, and I think the only way we're going to know is seeing how he serves on the court.
There's been criticism directed at the Republicans for their hardball tactics, as you mentioned. And at the same time, there is a lot of fury inside the Democratic Party now, Jack, at the performance of the Democratic senators, a feeling that they didn't really defend Anita Hill and they didn't really ask tough, penetrating questions of Judge Thomas.
Paul, the strongest comments that I've seen of any criticism of the Democrats has come from other Democrats. I mean, they are embarrassed. They can't believe what happened. I mean, you know, I've been in this town for 21 years, and they play a vicious brand of politics in Washington. Washington can be a mean town. This was as vicious a fight as I've ever seen, except it was totally one-sided. I've never seen the Democrats in such disarray. I've never seen them so dispirited. I mean, I think you're exactly right. Jesse Jackson called him up talking to him about this, and he said, well, you know, the thing about it was the minute Clarence Thomas mentioned the high-tech lynching and raised the racial issue, the Democrats were paralyzed, and they were. They sat back and you know, I don't know what was, and I heard a lot of Democrats say this in the past few days, they didn't know what was most disgraceful, the vicious attack that was launched by the Republicans on a witness who did not ask to go forward and was reluctant to go forward, but was asked by the Democrats to testify. The vicious attack on her, and then the Democrats' cowardice and standing back and let her being attacked without even being protected.
Well, as a matter of fact, there was only one Democrat when the issue came to the floor who stood up and spoke eloquently in her behalf.
Well, that's right, and that was Senator Bobby Byrd, the former Senate Democratic leader, who got up and said, as Haynes has pointed out, that his judicial temperament certainly did not come across there, but in addition to that, he said, you know, when he raises the race issue, it's ridiculous, because the case was a black woman making a complaint about against a black man, and it was racial. I mean, it was sexual.
And he came up and said, I will not give this committee the rope to hang me by, but at the same time, it was as if he had lassoed the Senate Judiciary Committee. Now, why were they so bowled over? I mean, you had Arlen Specter and Orrin Hatch on one side, and where was the counterattack? What happened to Senator
I'll tell you why
I'll
tell you why they were bowled over. For one thing, they had no strategy, unlike the Republican White House. They went in there. I talked to George Mitchell, the Senate Democratic leader, afterwards, and I told him that Jesse Jackson had asked, where were the senators and where was the Senate Democratic leader? And his answer was, I'm not a member of the committee. Our people on the committee work independently, and you know, and that's the way it's. And I will not second guess him, he says. So I think he thought that they acted all right.
Jack, you know, in 1988, everybody said Michael Dukakis ran such a bad campaign, and he did. He didn't respond to the attacks over and over again. And Washington, Democrats were saying, look at how bad they were, and they were bad, and so forth. But this time, the Democrats in Washington, in the Congress, the leaders, were doing exactly the same thing. It wasn't as though they weren't prepared or shouldn't have been prepared. So how does it happen? The attack strategy works, and they don't seem to have made any lesson. I mean, what is the lesson from this?
Well, I think that the Democrats are looking the same way the Republicans are. They're looking to get reelected, Haynes, and if you look at those Southern Democrats there who voted for Clarence Thomas, they know that they were elected last time with black votes, and the polls did play a part in it. And the polls showed that blacks favored Clarence Thomas by quite a margin.
Where was Joe Biden in all, excuse me, where was Joe Biden in all of this?
Well, Joe Biden was presiding, and as he kept saying, he was trying to preside very fairly, but the Democrats will tell you that once again he let the Republicans attack Anita Hill without calling them to account. When you had Alan Simpson standing up there like Joe McCarthy, reaching in his pockets and saying, I'm getting stuff through faxes and all over the country, he sounded just like Joe McCarthy, let's face it. And you had Arlen Specter, who was a prosecutor at one time, saying that she committed perjury, when probably you could find another prosecutor in the country that would tell you that she had committed perjury.
But we do have to say this, Jack, that it came down to one person's word against another person's word.
Well, that's right.
And I think that's how the committee and the Senate ultimately decided all this. And do you feel now that there is an opening here for the Republicans to gain black votes?
Well, yeah, I do think that. And not only that, the White House really thinks that. Pat Robertson, the TV evangelist, was over there talking to John Sununu, and afterwards told one of the reporters in our bureau that Sununu told him this was a watershed in American politics, and that the liberals had a chance to try to state their case, and they were embarrassed by it. Well, he is right about that. Today, Clarence Thomas was sworn in on the White House lawn. There were about 1,000 people there, several hundred Georgians, including quite a number of blacks. The interesting thing was that when Arlen Specter came in, they gave him a rousing ovation. They gathered around Alan Simpson and Orrin Hatch and Specter and asked for their autographs. These are people, and some of them talked to a Democratic friend of mine who was there, and they said the Democrats had made a big mistake in this.
Isn't this the irony that the White House that came in with Willie Horton, that has been against affirmative action and quotas, has now been able to trump with race and is even looking to the next election as a way to perhaps induce or lure more black voters?
And they may very well be able to do it. I talked to, like I say, a Democrat today who said that he talked to some of the Georgia Democrats who were there for the swearing in, and they said, you know, that the Democratic Party had made a big mistake, and they expected some inroads into the Democrats.
There's another notable irony here, too, and that is that Southern Democrats who fought so hard against civil rights legislation for so many years really provided the margin of victory to assure that the second black in history would take his place on the Supreme Court. Julie, you have been checking with women's organizations, and some of those groups are now saying that they intend to intensify their ballot box activity.
That's absolutely right, Paul. It's sort of what we saw this week is what happens when you have two conflicting constituencies sort of going head to head. In this case, as I said earlier, race trumped gender. I mean, when it came down to it, you had 52 senators slipping on their microphones, saying that they absolutely abhor sexual harassment. They're for women, and they said aye for Clarence Thomas, which has got women's groups furious. The National Women's Political Caucus, President Harriet Wood says a political genie has been unleashed from this bottle that she's not sure will be able to be stuffed back in. But the question is going to be for women's groups is whether or not they can really play hardball and take on their friends. One of the biggest disappointments for some of the women's group was the Pennsylvania Senator, Arlen Specter, in addition to the Democrats, which Jack has pretty well sketched out. They were disappointed by them, but Arlen Specter took on this role as the great inquisitor. Some people think he pilloried Anita Hill, that with his sort of low blow hit on perjury, they're saying to a friend in Pennsylvania who has been pro-choice, been on their side, how could you do this to me?
But where do women go? Where are women going to go if they like Specter and he's pro-choice? And what if he runs against a candidate as he is who's not? Who are they going to support?
Well, that's what's interesting, and that state is even a perfect example of that. Right now you have Attorney General Dick Thornburg running against an appointed candidate, Senator Wofford. Both of them are anti-abortion. Now, let's presume you go into the next campaign cycle. You've got Arlen Specter, who's pro-choice, in a state that's very conservative. The women's groups really can't make a gamble and go against someone pro-choice, I think, unless they've got a better candidate.
Isn't there a difference between the women's groups and women?
What?
I mean, the women voters are all over the place, just as we saw blacks are not a monolith, and we've heard about the gender gap over. In other words, did something come out of this, aside from the women's organizations, that really is going to change the behavior of women voters? Are they angry enough? Do we know enough to say this might energize them in a way that not a group can, but something emotional?
Well, the question is not only are they angry enough, but can they stay angry?
Right.
I mean, I think
or be motivated.
Or be motivated. Right. Will the anger lead to motivation to do something about it? I mean, there's two things that's odd about this particular race, and it's you first saw it with black support for Thomas being split fairly down the middle. Once the Anita Hill testimony came forth, again you saw women split. Many women believed him. Other women believed her. What's not at all clear is whether or not there's going to be a unifying force behind this particular incident. But what you think, I think you'll see is next week the Civil Rights Act comes before the Senate, in which there's gender discrimination and compensatory damage language that will be another test for senators. There will be cases before the court coming up, sexual harassment case. I think with all of those things leading us up to the '92 election, then there may be enough to sustain some women's activity.
Well, on this point of the elections, Julie, for some 30 years now, we've been hearing talk of women making greater gains, winning more seats in Congress. There's still only 2 women in the Senate. And that's all it is talk. They just have not made significant headway in electing more women to Congress. Do you think realistically they have any hope in 1992?
Well, probably not, and this is why I will tell you this, Paul. It is Nancy Kassebaum came to the floor saying, I am a U.S. Senator first, not a woman. Barbara Mikulski voted against Judge Thomas, obviously. But what you have is the question of, in the Senate, will there be a difference? In 1990, 8 women ran for the Senate, including against 2 men who sat on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Brown from Colorado defeated a woman, and Senator Simon defeated a woman. And what we found is they didn't make it. There's a fundraising problem. Will it be a difference? I'm not so sure.
How did, by the way, Clarence Thomas get away with saying that it was a racial issue, that it was a high-tech lynching, when it was a black woman accusing a black man? I mean, I don't understand. He did seem to get away with it, and a number of blacks apparently seemed to agree with him. And, of course, he raised the whole thing of the racial stereotype of a male and so forth.
Well, I think you put your finger on something that's always plagued the women's movement. The women's movement has traditionally been an upper-middle-class, largely white, largely urban entity, which didn't bring in a lot of ways, black women. So what you had in this case, even though it was in some ways sort of a clear-cut gender question at issue here, black woman against black man, it sort of took on this.
Was it the white Senate committee, though, too?
Right, and they helped. I mean, it was almost they were complicit.
But Julie, also, the question of sexual harassment, we heard so much about it's real, we know that. Isn't this going to make a difference, or do you think it will out of this? Is that going to make a difference in the way the workplace is and the way politics is performed?
Well, I think a lot of people have become sensitized. In fact, all the senators said that their consciousness had been raised. And in Washington, they said it, but in Washington you heard people on subways talking about how their offices would change. Well, now you can't take a joke, but I think what you're going to sort of see is a momentary, a 30-second, a soundbite sensitization, and then we're going to go back to business as usual.
But at least there is a higher sensitivity now.
That's right.
I mean, for many people, there probably
right.
will be.
And people who hadn't thought of it before.
Furthermore, the whole problem has now been given great attention, too. In any event, we really have to conclude that this is a big week for George Bush, and he is riding very high at the moment, Haynes. Today, for example, the president achieved another one of his major goals when it was announced that there will be, after all, a Middle East peace conference. This has been one of Mr. Bush's major objectives ever since the Persian Gulf War ended. And I think we have to say that primarily it's because of the persistence and the perseverance of Secretary of State Baker. At the same time, the president won 2 other major battles on Capitol Hill this week.
Well, I guess you could say he's like Caesar this week in a way, if you take the pure politics of it. And the Middle East, the conference and the peace conference in the Middle East is something every American president since the State of Israel was founded has been trying to get put together. And if it works, it will be a great for the world and so forth. But clearly, in terms of domestic politics, what we've heard here, we talk about the Democrats, the Republican strategy, the disarray of the women's groups, and here we've been dealing with 2 intensely controversial confirmation battles, and he won them both. The Thomas case we've talked about, everybody knows. Today, Friday, Robert Gates was confirmed to be the CIA director, and this was in many ways by the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Joint Select Committee on Intelligence in the Senate. And here you have another case of a Democratic-led Senate committee, and they voted, it wasn't even close like the vote on Thomas, it was 11-4. And the Gates, need we remind our viewers, it was sort of brushed aside, was intensely controversial. The Gates was involved with the Iran-Contra and imputations that he had not told the truth, that he'd been wrong on the reading of the world, all these things. And when it came down in the end, it didn't matter. And then to add to that, the Democrats were together in one way this week, Jack. They did get all of the Democratic members of the Senate to vote unanimously to override President Bush's veto of a bill extending unemployment benefits for those who have run out after 26 weeks. 3.1 million Americans don't have unemployment benefits in a very grave recession, and they couldn't overturn it.
But they fell short.
They fell short.
Yeah.
Again, so even when they were together, there still is, so you're right, it's in terms of the politics of it.
But let me ask you on the Gates nomination, though. Here's another case where the White House and the Bush administration had a strategy, and apparently the Democrats had no strategy, unless it was that some of the Democrats were actually working with the White House. Some Democrats were very critical of the fact that Chairman Boren had letters written to him in support of Gates by former CIA directors that were solicited by Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor of the White House. Now, they say that looks like complicity to them.
The committee, as you know, David Boren of Oklahoma, has felt all along, and he said it repeatedly, and he said it again today, that he believes in a bipartisan approach, that they need to heal. There's a whole process that must go forward, that we can work with Mr. Gates. He said he's made mistakes. He's acknowledged them. He gave a great mea culpa. Yes, I was wrong. And this is not a time to bring someone who isn't versed. He's also very close to the president. He's inside the White House, so he can go back to CIA. Now, there are problems here. And some of the Democratic members, Sam Nunn of Georgia, very influential, did say he was worried about the condition inside the CIA, and he's going to watch it very carefully. But he voted for it.
How about a Senate floor fight on the confirmation?
I don't think it will, Jack. No? If you get in a vote of 11 to 4. I mean, it seems
4
to
Democrats.
Me, yeah, 4 Democrats only. I don't see that. I think that issue is done.
I had a Democratic senator tell me this week that Bob Gates never met Anita Hill, but perhaps he should thank her because now the floor vote is going to be a lot easier for Bob Gates. Maybe they're just not up for a fight. Could that be part of it? I think that's probably true, as a matter of fact, because after this, everybody's exhausted and drained by this thing.
You mean the Democrats are exhausted and drained? What did they do?
Everybody, but I mean, and just there's no taste for confrontation on this. And now, losing, you come up to Gates and that's it.
We've had references tonight to the special interest groups, yes. And another special interest group that was quite assertive this week was the NRA in another battle involving gun control legislation.
Paul, at the backdrop of we heard in the Anita Thomas and Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill case that the special interest groups were out there doing all these things and how bad that was, and so and the liberals were after it. Well, here you have a case which showed you that the Congress is up for grabs for any interest groups that is well organized, financed, knows the technique, and here you have gun control, again, a bill to come up to ban semi-automatic weapons, and the debate actually begins on the day in which the greatest mass murder in American history takes place in Texas, and then they vote the day after that, and overwhelmingly go into so the NRA, the National Rifle Association, triumph. It shows you the power of the interest groups.
We've really been on an emotional roller coaster all week, I think, all of us, following all of these events. And it seems to me at the end of the week, the one thing that strikes you is that the political partisanship in our town is really accelerating. It's not diminishing at all.
There's a great deal of talk about reform of the process, and we can't go through this again, and how dirty it was, and how vicious, and McCarthyism, and sexism, and racism, and unfair. And the truth is that I'm afraid it does go forward. Everything we've heard here tonight, and I believe it too, we see it works. It's a campaign. It's at the White House tonight. That was a campaign.
But don't we have a polarizing president, though?
Well,
I mean,
yes, we do.
I mean,
Jack.
he is a very partisan president. There's no question about it.
There are things you can do. I mean, you can remove the partisanship. You can get more advice than consent. You can have hearings and behind closed doors and sensitive issues like this. You don't have to go through the whole awful pornographic material in front of the country. At the same time, I don't think the system that we're seeing now is going I think we're going to have more of it, not less, I'm afraid.
Well, we have no more time, that's for sure. That's it for this edition. I'm Paul Duke. Good night for all of us here on Washington Week.
Washington Week in Review was produced by WETA, which is solely responsible for its content. Ford Motor Company, worldwide manufacturer of automotive products, has provided funding for this program. At Ford, quality is job one. Funding for this program was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you. For a transcript of this program, send $4 to Washington Week in Review, Journal Graphics Incorporated, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007, or call 212-227-READ. This is...
Partial funding for Washington Week in Review is provided by the people of HMO, Iowa, who are working to make quality health care available to families across Iowa. And by ANR Pipeline Company, a subsidiary of the Coastal Corporation and an integral part of the natural gas industry of Iowa, proud to help bring the Iowa broadcast of Washington Week in Review to you. ANR Pipeline Company urges you to support public television.
You're viewing Iowa Public Television. Enjoy more TV worth watching in 1/2 hour.
It's a small-town celebration for a typically big city operation, the opening of a shopping mall in rural Iowa. But not everyone is celebrating. The Mauling of Rural America on Market to Market, tonight at 8 on Iowa Public Television.
Next time on Frontline, an investigation of government mismanagement in the savings and loan bailout.
The biggest giveaway I have seen in the federal government since I have been here.
Frontline examines how presidential politics delayed action and magnified the problem.
I'd say we probably could have saved half of what we're now going to have to pay.
The Great American Bailout on Frontline.
Watch Tuesday at 8.
You're watching Iowa Public Television.
TV worth watching, IPTV.
The investment executives of Dane Bosworth, with offices in Cedar Rapids, Davenport, Des Moines, Dubuque, Iowa City, Sioux City, and Waterloo, are proud to provide financial support for the acquisition and broadcast of Wall Street Week. And the Iowa broadcast of Wall Street Week is proudly underwritten